This show has been brought to you by Smith's Detection and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association.
My voice is the voice that guides you home safely each and every day.
24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
I am the voice of the safest and most efficient airspace in the world.
I have to be 100% of the time.
I am.
I am.
I am.
I am a professional air traffic controller.
I'm joined in the studio today by Pat Foye, the Executive Director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Pat, thanks very much for being with us.
Todd, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
The Port Authority has a massive capital plan over the next 10 years. Bridges, tunnels, airports, mass transit, $32 billion. How do you execute on something like that, and what are the biggest challenges you face?
It's a great point. I ought to note our board unanimously approved the capital plan in February, this past February, $32 billion, you suggest. Nearly $12 billion for airports, and significant investments in Newark, JFK, and LaGuardia, as well as Teterboro and Stewart, but the big three in particular. Executing is a kind of where the rubber meets the road, to kind of coin a cliche. I think that our processes have improved substantially over the last 5 or 10 years. One of the things we've been doing in the last 3 or 4 years is, where it makes sense, pursuing public-private partnerships. Which we take a horses-to-courses approach. There are certain projects where P3s make sense. There are others that don't. So, for instance, at LaGuardia, we're pursuing the country's largest P3 at Central Terminal Building, New Terminal B. And at Newark, we're doing a fixed-price design build. So every project of $500 million or more, we will look at through a P3 prism. That's not to say every project we'll do as a P3. We definitely don't expect to. But where the best risk-adjusted execution for the public is a P3, we'll pursue it.
So let's talk about one of those,
Sure.
LaGuardia.
Yep.
$4 billion
4.2
or so,
Sure.
$1 billion project.
Yep.
And after debating how to do it, you decided to go with a P3.
We did.
Primary advantage of that?
Primary advantage threefold. One is private sector innovation and expertise, and I'll give you a concrete example of that in a second. Second is having the private sector partners, including Skanska Walsh, which is the, LaGuardia is being done by LaGuardia Gateway Partners, a consortium of Meridian, Vantage, the airport operator, and Skanska. Skanska is one of the largest construction companies in the world, also a AAA credit, major construction firm around the world, including in the United States and New York. Having that group put $200 million at risk. Thirdly, we've got a fixed price contract. LaGuardia project is a very complicated piece of construction and engineering and execution, because the terminal, which is old, it was built in 1964, been improved over the years, has to continue operating. We can't tell the public we're closing LaGuardia for 4 or 5 years, come back. The LGP team, so our engineers, we've got about 500 engineers, among the best public sector engineers in the country, I believe, put out an indicative design to the marketplace. And LGP and the other bidders, but LGP in particular, came back with an approach that was better, that shortened the timeline, reduced the cost, and we're able to shift the risk of execution, delivery, and capped our cost to a private, well-capitalized private sector party that's got $200 million up. And that's why we decided to pursue on LaGuardia a P3.
Now, you're also coming to the table with substantial money for that project.
We are.
And a big chunk of that is PFC money.
Big chunk of it is. There's $1 billion of PFCs on the Central Terminal B project. Most of that is into common infrastructure, roadways, electric infrastructure, et cetera. And we thought, obviously subject to FAA approval, as any PFC amount would be. Well, one of the questions that was raised, including actually by President Trump at a meeting at the White House on February 9th, is a very astute question that an experienced real estate developer president would ask, which is $200 million of equity enough on a $4.2 billion project? Insightful question. And the answer is no, it's not. But the reason we pursued it was, in addition to the $200 million of equity, there's $1 billion of PFCs. When you think about it, PFCs are incredibly valuable to us and every other airport operator. We count on them in our capital plan, the $32 billion capital plan. A significant part of the $12 billion that we'll spend over the next years on our airports is based on PFCs, and they're included in our capital plan, and we value them greatly. The PFCs reduced the amount of risk in the transaction, and when you think about it, are a form of almost junior equity, because while they're incredibly valuable funding source, there's no equity return or debt return that has to be paid on this PFCs. So they made it possible to do the transaction with a $200 million equity piece, but reduce the risk. And really, when you think about it, it's $1.2 billion of equity that we've got in the transaction on a $4.2 billion base.
So it allows greater leverage.
It allows greater leverage. I actually would turn the question around. I think it reduces leverage because it's not a $200 million equity piece on a $4.2 billion transaction. It's $1.2 billion of equity on a $4.2 billion transaction. And what it does is, because the PFCs have to be invested in the airports, in this case LaGuardia, it returns to the passengers who paid those, in the case of LaGuardia, a better airport. Both the Terminal B transaction, the current Central Terminal building, as well as new Terminal C that Delta is in the process of pursuing.
So that's LaGuardia.
Yep.
You mentioned at the top of the show Newark.
Yep.
You went a different way on Newark.
We did go a different way on Newark, just as we did. We're opening 2 bridges, one in June and one Governor Christie basically just opened. And we took the same approach. On the Goethals Bridge, we did a $1.5 billion public-private partnership, including $500 million of low-cost TIFI alone from US DOT, for which we're incredibly appreciative. And then on the Bayonne Bridge, we pursued that as a traditional Port Authority construction project, financed it with tax-exempt bonds. LaGuardia we did for the reasons I described as a P3. Newark Terminal A is nothing in airports, an operating airport is a simple construction project, but far simpler because in many ways the new Terminal A at Newark is a greenfield construction project that's being done adjacent to the existing terminal, and we don't have the same challenge, lots of challenges at Newark at Terminal A, but we didn't have the same challenge of having to operate a terminal while construction was continuing. So on that one, we thought the best risk-adjusted approach for the public in coming up with a new Terminal A was to do it as a fixed-price design build, but financed by the Port Authority, tax-exempt borrowing.
So in Washington, D.C., with shrinking federal dollars available,
Right.
lots of increased conversation and discussion around P3s.
Yep.
You've proven, even in a place as highly populated and financially savvy as New York, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the principles that people should be looking at as to whether or not a P3 would work in their airport?
It's a good question. There is a lot of mystery around public-private partnerships, and I think there's a couple of things that ought to be said. One is, and I'll take New York and New Jersey as an example. The history of building major infrastructure in the United States, a lot of it's been built with private capital to begin with, and I'll talk about New York and New Jersey. The PATH train system was originally built with private capital. The PATH tunnels under the Hudson were built with private capital. The tunnels that Amtrak in New Jersey used to get from New York to New Jersey and vice versa was built with private capital by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Grand Central Terminal was built by the New York Central Railroad. The subways were built by competing investor groups. I could go on and on. The point is that using private capital to build infrastructure is not unusual or unknown in our country. And a growing country in the 1800s and 1900s used lots of private capital. So that's point one. Point two is public-private partnerships are a means, they're not an end in and of themselves. And the question that we're going to look at every project in our capital plan over $500 million through a prism of public-private partnership to see whether it makes sense. I would expect that 80–90% of them will make a decision to go forward on a traditional basis, and maybe my percentage is off one way or the other. But we're going to pursue probably larger, more challenging projects. But the point is, what is the best execution for the public on a risk-adjusted basis to get this project done? And should the public sector bear the risk on Project A of construction, of execution, of cost overruns, and being able to take advantage of private sector innovation and expertise? And that's the debate that we'll have on each significant project.
You mentioned a little earlier the February 9th meeting with President Trump.
Right.
And there was a series of airline executives and airport officials in the meeting. You were the kind of the guy from New York who actually could talk to him apples to apples on real estate and development. Give me your sense of, you mentioned one example about he had an astute question. Other takeaways from that meeting?
Well, the president's a customer of LaGuardia and JFK, and we thank him for his business, both as a private citizen and as president of the United States. And we take that responsibility seriously, as we do every one of the 100 million plus people who fly through our airports, especially the big ones, Newark, JFK, and LaGuardia. The president was very focused on the public-private partnership. Obviously, that's an important part of his infrastructure package. I think the Port Authority is proud, and he was very interested in, as I said, in the details of how LaGuardia, the P3 worked. We talked about about passenger facility charges, and he and his team were very interested in how the public-private partnerships could work, how they could be accelerated. There was also unanimity in the room, and I expect this will be an important part of the president's infrastructure program, that the permitting process in the United States, both at the federal and state levels, for all sorts of infrastructure, but including airports. And I have to say that the FAA is one of from a environmental point of view, a NEPA point of view, EIS, EA point of view, the FAA, I believe, is one of the most effective and enlightened regulators. That's not to say that there isn't room for improvement on the airport operator side and on the agency processing. But some projects in other infrastructure modes and other transportation modes, you hear stories about NEPA processes going on for 5 or 6 or 10 years. That's insane. In a country where we all recognize that the infrastructure investment deficit is measured in trillions of dollars, and where it's clearly the case that the current state of job creation and retention is being affected by the state of the infrastructure, including in the airport space, right? There was a study done by the Partnership for New York City some number of years ago that concluded, with expert independent help, that the cost of air traffic control congestion in the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia region was $75 billion over a period of 15 to 18 years. That's an extraordinary sum of money, and it's holding our economy back.
Gina Marie Lindsay, who used to run the Seattle airport before she ran the Los Angeles airport, testified on Capitol Hill years ago talking about the challenges associated with building the new runway in Seattle and the environmental review and approval process, and made the point that the environmental review and approval process for that runway took longer than it took to build the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Yeah. It took 18 years for the environmental review and approval process.
Look, any project like a new runway, a new bridge, a new tunnel, replacing an existing rail tunnel, should get a serious environmental review. We're all environmentalists, and we and our children and grandchildren care deeply about air quality, water quality, and just the state of the environment. That's not the issue. I believe, as other countries, Canada, Germany, Australia, other countries, Sweden, the other countries that care about their environments, that the environmental process can be done in a year or two. It can be done in a serious way without compromising the quality of the environment. No one wants to do that. The other point I'd argue is, just thinking about it from a Port Authority point of view, the Bayonne Bridge, we're raising the bridge to allow larger container ships to come through. We're also working as the lead partner on the Gateway Rail Tunnel under the Hudson to replace a 100-year-old tunnel. If the new tunnel is not completed before the old one fails, which will happen at some point, it's not only an economic and transportation disaster, it's an environmental disaster, because you'll have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of cars and buses taken from rail and added to already crowded bridges and tunnels and highways. Same thing with the Bayonne Bridge. We're raising the bridge. I mentioned we're doing it not as a P3, traditional Port Authority deal. We're raising the bridge to allow larger container ships to come through. The larger container ships are newer, burn less fuel per container, less fuel per iPad, emit less emissions per container, iPad, pair of Nike sneakers, et cetera. New technologies are generally environmentally more friendly, consume less energy per unit of consumption. And dragging the process out for 5 or 10 or, God forbid, 15 years is really insane.
Got time for one last question.
Yes, sir.
Air traffic control modernization.
Yep.
Port Authority has cared a lot about this issue for obvious reasons.
Right.
You have delays in your airports. It cascades through the system. Where do you think we stand on that issue?
Well, look, I'd say a couple of things. One is I applaud the administration for taking the issue on and studying it and reaching out to consumers, to airports, to airlines, to general aviation, to labor, et cetera. I applaud that. Our belief is that the air traffic control system is in dire need of investment. It's in dire need of reform. What the specific reform is going to be proposed, I think we're all eager, and we've all been in conversations with the President's advisors in the White House, and obviously with both the House of Representatives and the Senate. I think the devil, like most things, is in the details, but there's no question that the air traffic control system, first, lags other countries around the world. Two, including our neighbor to the north, Canada, is in need of billions of dollars investment and is a current drag on economic activity, to say nothing of inconvenience and congestion for business and leisure passengers. Something's got to be done.
We'll see how that plays out in the weeks and months ahead.
We will.
Pat, that's all the time we've got today. Thank you for being
Todd,
with
thanks
us.
very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for watching.